So as we've discussed today, we're, as a community, dealing with a lot of different diseases, and two red leaf diseases in particular, leaf roll and red blotch. But as we've discussed today, red blotch is posing specific challenges. What have you, Ashton, found to be most challenging about this specific disease?
I would say it obviously can spread exponentially if you're not paying attention to it. Additionally, you're not always seeing symptoms. There's a latency period where vines may be positive and they're just hanging out, potentially, infecting other vines.
And Jake?
I would say, the spread is definitely a challenge, and there's still a lot of unknowns about the virus, right? We're continuously learning new things every year, whether it's in-house from lamp testing to university research. So we're trying to apply the knowledge that we have when we have it, but like I said, it's every year is something new.
Kia, as a grape grower yourself and vineyard owner, how did you become aware of this particular challenge?
So I had one of those meetings that people were talking about before, actually several, and I would say part of it was we had virus pressure from the outside with our neighbors, and part of the difficult discussion was to talk about how do you synchronize your actions to them. Unfortunately, one of my neighbors ended up replanting, which is maybe good for us, but not good for his 28-year-old vineyard. He's 83. He said, I'm not sure if I'm going to see my next fruit. And that kind of really inspired us as a neighborhood to kind of take it very seriously. Economically, it's disastrous for the reasons that we know, around longevity and kind of economic. But I think there's also an element of proactive measure that you have to take. And so people who have been proactive around more testing and more roguing and being on top of things have been rewarded. 6 years later, after that replant, I still have the majority of my vineyard intact. But that takes a lot of surveillance, a lot of testing, and oftentimes the budget I found is a challenge because we all have a farming budget, and that farming budget doesn't take into account the amount of testing that you have to do. And that's a difficult discussion to have, I found, with the stakeholders.
Yeah, on that note, I know Jake and Ashton have been both very proactive in our community about being aware of this and talking about it. Have you faced pushback at all, budget-wise, or how have you had those conversations to allow you to do the extensive testing that you've done?
When we originally started testing in 2021, it was more of just from a trial perspective. We knew we had a problem in one of the blocks, and we were one of the issues on Pritchard Hill is sometimes the leaves defoliate, right? So you can't see symptomatic vines when you have no leaves. So that's when we expanded our testing. And in the beginning, I've heard from some people, well, Napa Valley in the 70s and 80s, it was all red. This isn't a problem. It was when we started mapping the actual spread and we could show the maps, that's when it was like, okay, this thing is moving and can literally have wings and take off. So
did you feel like the mapping helped you tell this story to get behind the testing?
Yes, it was 100% the mapping, I think, is really what drove home the point of this is a problem.
And from what I'm familiar with, you use different mapping techniques. All three of you use different ways of documenting the incidence and spread of the virus. Can I point to each of you sequentially to say what your experience is with mapping and documenting this problem?
Originally, we started out with paper grids generated by ArcGIS, and now have moved into using a GNSS sub-meter connected to field maps through the ArcGIS platform, and each vine is addressed. So luckily enough, walking into wanting to test, we already had all of our vines addressed. That is not, but someone works for us and does ArcGIS full time, not me.
We ended up, I actually ended up first doing this on paper, then I co-founded a company with Mason Earls out of UC Davis that called Scout, and we use Scout now for the last 2 years to map every vine and then use the virus techniques, evaluation techniques to at least create field notes so that you have something that's documented.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo what you guys did. You know, we all started on paper or Excel and spending lots of time and hours and money doing that. And each year, I think we've got progressively, more efficient and using different technologies. And so we're essentially doing similar to what they're doing. I've also tried using AI, essentially with your cell phone, and attaching it to an ATV. And because every year we go out and we flag any symptomatic vines, so essentially we would just be able to drive down a row and it would see the flag on the trunk and drop a GPS point on that and then generate a map of it, which would be a lot faster and thus cheaper to do. So that's still kind of in the works, but it's something that I think we're moving towards, or the industry in general is probably moving towards.
And how do you coordinate your mapping efforts with your testing, especially with asymptomatic vines? I know that's an especial challenge. If you're mapping, it's likely symptomatic vines. Mm-hmm. How are you approaching understanding where that border is?
Yeah, that's a good question. Essentially, after we get our maps, we're utilizing LAMP now as well, and what we're looking at is, from an infected vine, if it's kind of a one-off, we would be sampling the nearest neighbors to see if there is a potential hotspot there that we can identify before it kind of blows up. And then where there's already hot spots that have formed, we're trying to kind of delineate an area that we could essentially spatially rogue all of the vines, knowing that the likelihood of, if let's say we pulled out just the symptomatic vines, we know that next year and the following year there's going to be more red vines that show up within that area. So we're trying to get ahead of it rather than, for the last 15 years just chasing our tail, essentially.
Yeah. And I'll give a shout out to Ashton, who's really been leading the charge in the asymptomatic vine testing and really looked into trunk sampling, which helped our team look further into trunk sampling as well. So can you tell us more about that?
So our testing strategy has been mark anything that looks funny. We will then go, this year our plan is we'll pull canes, multiple canes. The virus is very non-uniform in how it's distributed through parts of the vine. So we will test those. If they're positive, they're marked on the map. If we see around 5 vines in an area, we call that, in a small area, so 20 to 40 feet, we consider that to be a hot spot. And then we will go out around 40 feet from that hot spot and test all of the vines surrounding it. Using trunk testing, so in-season trunk testing, in-field. And we will try and do that probably in June, and then mark anything that comes back up symptomatic and repeat the process for multiple years. So it's a lot. It comes with its challenges, for sure.
Kiatra, do you have something to add?
Yeah, so our challenge, and again, this is not every vineyard, also is that in the blocks that we have been, seeing more disease, they tend to be Schwartzman rootstock that stress, so water stress shows, so the symptomatics are actually not really symptomatic if you kind of go down that route. So we've been working on, with Scout, to effectively create a heat map of all the red leaves so that you can run it throughout the season. So if you see something early in the season, maybe that's malnourishment, and you can then check that off as a lesser suspect. I know they could also be disease there, but probability is a little bit lower.
Yeah.
And we're hoping that data science and math is going to give us a better sampling criteria, so that you're actually using a combination of in-field lab tests and then areas that maybe you're not looking at that could be asymptomatic.
Yeah.
I found that a lot of my budget for testing was being sucked up by non-virus red-leafed vines. So I reallocated many of those into asymptomatic budget to better use digital and other techniques for the red sampling, if that makes sense. And this is a work in progress. I don't want to say it works 100%, but I think it's helpful for you to think about a budget. We used to in engineering in my former life call it a error budget that you have, or defect budget that you have. And that kind of helps you make better decisions so that you have full coverage, as opposed to saying, I'm not going to test any asymptomatic wines and I'm going to oversample the red ones that.
And you touched on something earlier that I want to speak to, is the delayed symptom development,
Yes.
which is another particular challenge to red blotch. I experienced personally this year. One of our home blocks is also a study block, and no virus that we could map. I was out there with Hannah and Monica mapping it. We didn't find anything. A week later, one vine popped up after our team particularly picked that date. And it's just so challenging. What have your experiences with the timing of your symptom identification?
Yeah, so I mean, especially with the amount of acreage we have to start early. So we've now learned that more virus, we'll see more vines pop up in later passes, and so we'll typically try and hit everything, as early as possible, September, and then come back and do a second pass and try and catch anything that we missed. And it's a challenge.
Ashton, do you visit multiple times?
We try to scout each block 3 different times. So one prior to harvest, and then multiple times post-harvest. And then there are some years where there are no leaves. So if we know that there's a hot spot in that given area, that's when we'll just go through and test canes during dormancy.
Speaking of hot spots, is there a certain incidence level and/or hot spot pattern that will lead you to make different management decisions in terms of very, very, very low incidence vine by vine roguing, zonal roguing, and at what percent do you make that hard decision to remove an entire block?
We don't necessarily have like a percent threshold yet. We'll probably get there, but like I mentioned earlier, we're gonna try and utilize LAMP to delineate those potentially hotspot areas and see where we can kind of draw a line. Yeah.
What we've done is create pick zones that include or exclude them, and then look at a percentage of infected plants within a pick zone, so that you ultimately are also making a decision around yield and what goes into a product versus what doesn't. In rule, most of any infected fruit doesn't make it gets declassified, but you still want to at least measure it and understand kind of what. This is part of the economic thinking of how do I replant soon enough so that I have something to replenish in that block as it comes out. Yeah. And we just felt rows and blocks are somewhat limiting.
Ashton, in your experience, have you had to make that really hard decision to replant an entire block, or have you mainly been doing zonal?
Yes, so actually this previous year, I've always been curious about latency. Now there is a paper out that identifies the latency, and we took out, I want to say 2,000 vines in a given area, and then tried to create a buffer zone, went in, retested everything, and kept seeing, red vines pop up. Even though we're testing, we're roguing, we're doing all of these things. And so what we decided to do is we're going to randomly test 100 vines using trunk testing, and we found a 9% asymptomatic positive rate. And so at that point, we were like, okay, we can't save this block.
How big was your buffer? Just curious.
The buffer, I think, was 25 feet, so it wasn't large enough. Yeah.
Going forward, do you think you'd go closer to that 40 feet, or based on experience?
Yes, I'd go 40 plus feet. Anything that was also surrounding this area, not even, in that given block, we went 50 feet from the edge all the way in to test every vine.
A lot's been talked today about neighbors and neighborhoods, and the idea of talking to your neighbors when you have to do a big replant like that. There's the challenging decision of, if they're not budging, what are the economics of keeping it fallow? Is that something that you would consider, or is that management-wise really a tough pill to swallow economically?
We are keeping blocks fallow right now.
You are.
Some, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and part of that is knowing that there's adjacent blocks, whether it's our own or a neighbor's, that are still in place and have high infection. And so, we've made the decision that it's not worth it to put vines back in the ground yet in those cases. We've seen, year over year, where we, pull block A out and leave block B out, which is highly infected, and replant block A, right? And then it's just moving back and forth. And so that's kind of where we're at right now in terms
But you have had one of the grower success stories of working with your neighbor. Can you elaborate?
Yeah.
On that?
Fortunately, we've had some success with our Rutherford neighborhood group, and between ourselves and our neighbor across the road, we're pulling like 170 acres out, and trying to be, work together on what goes back in, what makes the most sense. And part of that decision, like I said, is, okay, if we're potentially, this block down here is still staying in, that might have some level of virus, let's not plant anything back there to try and work, we'll work towards that area.
Speaking of neighbors, both of you I know are involved, Jake and Ashton, in the neighborhood groups. Do you think that's given you an edge up in your management decision making, or how do you feel like participating in some of the neighborhood groups that Malcolm alluded to has helped you in your careers dealing with red blotch?
We were a part of the Tika trapping, and so having those discussions of, okay, are you seeing torticollis, are you seeing Tika, and then talking about what other people are doing, as well as, are people roguing? We also had a success story with roguing entire blocks with our neighbor. We gave them red blotch, they gave it back to us, we gave it back to them, and then so this past a year and a half ago, we decided, okay, we're going to replant this all together and try and, but having these discussions in a neighborhood group, it just facilitates the conversation. And if we're getting clean together, then it's much more prosperous.
Yeah, I would say it just, if anything, it helps because you feel so isolated for such a long time, and we've been dealing with this for almost 15 years now, and so I think for a long time people weren't really talking about it, and you kind of just lived in your own world, and you're like, oh my God, is it just me? But, right?
Yeah.
And so now, I mean, here we are on stage talking about it, and you know, I think it's just raising awareness, and giving people a little more like confidence, I guess, you know, to discuss the issue.
Great. Red blotch support groups.
Yeah.
We all need
Yeah.
it. If someone were replanting a new block from scratch today, coming into the industry, what advice would you have for them? Say they're coming in a bubble. Best practices.
I would talk to your neighbors. It's
Start
so,
clean.
Yeah, I would say like, I'm fairly lucky up at Continuum. We're on Pritchard Hill. We only have one neighbor. But I feel for anybody who is planting a new block and is surrounded by dirty plant material, because it's just, I think we've all seen some vineyards in Napa who have been pulled out after 6 years.
Yeah.
And it's,
I think it's, and just raising their awareness, right? So they're not caught off guard. Because I mean, I hear stories of, growers or owners that are like, I don't know what that is. I've never heard of red blotch. What is that? Which is baffling to me, but it happens. So.
Yeah. One of the topics that was brought up by the earlier researchers with A&R was that maybe as a science community, we also have had a, quote, failure to address the questions being asked. For the scientific community here and the researchers in the room, what questions as a grower would you like to see on future grant applications? What questions as a community should we be trying to tackle? Obviously, we need to do scientific method. Due diligence is slow, and this is moving fast, and that's a challenge. But what questions do you have that we can
I have
address?
one. In fact, this was brought up today with several discussions, which is the impact of viral load. A lot of the tests that we have are binary. And with other viral diseases, there's a load amount that can tell you a lot about symptomatic versus non-symptomatic. Could the non-symptomatic ones have a lower viral load? Does the viral load impact the direction in which the disease is spread? I just don't know if those things are being studied as hard. And I would love the lab testing that's so expensive to actually provide some of that detail, so that we can at least, put the data together and make decisions around maybe longevity or, kind of the contagiousness of the disease or the plant.
I would like to know how long it, on average, takes from when Tika, infects a plant to when the vine actually tests positive, and that's probably not the same across all varietals. So, in my experience, Cabernet Sauvignon takes a lot longer to show symptoms than Cabernet Franc or Merlot. So
We called Jake our resident Tika whisperer because he can creep up on them with a high success rate. So in your experience mapping girdles, Jake, do you have any anecdotal experience you can share with us between when you're seeing those girdles and seeing infected vines? I know we have a documented 3-year latency now, but in your experience?
Not yet. We're with one of our clients. We're working on that. So we've been monitoring girdles now across all of our acres for 2 years, and that's on a weekly basis from June through October, essentially. And so from that, we've really been able to get a good idea of when we're seeing peak, first generation peaks or second generation peaks, and mapping has been beneficial to see, where we're seeing the girdles occur. And then, but to answer your question, we're working on it, and we have flagged girdled vines and are monitoring them kind of on a quarterly basis to see, if and when they may turn red.
Can you talk more about your approach to finding Tika from those girdles?
Yeah.
If someone curious to know if they had it in their vineyard, how they go about
so
that?
I think it was just kind of happenstance when I came, I was just looking for girdles, and then there just happened to be Tika on like that single red girdled leaf, that you typically see. And it just kind of putting, two and two together, and then I kept seeing the same thing. I'd see one girdled leaf, and then I'd see a Tika, like literally feeding on it. And they're pretty sneaky because you walk up to it and they'll like roll around to the backside of the patio and try and hide, or they'll jump away. They're pretty quick. And so, we've had, pretty good success in terms of finding Tika in our vineyards. I don't know if that's a good thing, but and catching them. And fortunately, because of that, we've been able to send them to university research to help out with that. So,
Are you monitoring Tika at either of your vineyard sites?
Only with sticky traps for the past 2 years, but I mean, they're not attracted to the yellow, so I mean, it's hit or miss.
Right. We've had similar experiences. They jump right out of them. They're jumpers.
Yeah, to add to that, I mean, we've had high density trapping with yellow sticky traps in a vineyard in a very small area, maybe 100 or 200 square feet, and they're there all season, not a single catch. And I think I walked in there with Monica and someone else, and within like seconds, I was like, "There's one." Like, so I wouldn't necessarily rely on like yellow sticky traps as presence or absence.
Mm-hmm. And have you noticed a correlation between populations and percent incidence year 1, 2, 3?
No, but I think what we are seeing is it's kind of what they've always said. You have to have both, right? You have to have a vector and you have to have a virus, right? And the blocks where we're catching Tika and we have high levels of virus, those Tika are testing positive for the virus. Mm-hmm. Makes sense, right?
Yeah. How does it affect you as growers when winemakers come in and want to do sequential harvesting, differential harvesting? Are your efforts, two questions, I guess. Are you in communication so that your efforts are in tandem, that you're helping them make pre-decisions in a way? And then how is it affecting your budgets as you have to do different harvests?
So at Continuum, it's a fairly unique, we're one estate, one wine. We don't buy any fruit. So it's a very tight-knit community between the vineyard and the winery. And because of that, we have a very low tolerance of red blotch. So we don't do any sequential, if it's got red blotch, it's gotta go. It can affect the entire economic viability of the company, so.
So it's affecting total yield, not per vine or per grape or per cluster yield. It's affecting the total quantity of the product that you're able to put on the table.
Yes.
Yeah.
So on Pritchard Hill too, we have more tannin, right? So, and if there's a vine with red blotch, that mouthfeel of the subsequent wine and then also the tannin quality becomes more rustic, and you'll be able to pick those lots out. Mm-hmm. And so those, we just have no tolerance for it.
Mm-hmm. Kia, you have
Yeah, so
that?
I think this was one of the things that Scout helped us, was because it wasn't a virus map and a pick map. They were one system. So we could measure where the virus is. On one hand, we have a roguing strategy with a very low tolerance. So that's about keeping the vineyard as disease-free as possible based on what we have. But then understanding that as those pick zones maybe shrink, what is the impact to the bottom line or the lots? And I think doing one without the other is very difficult, because this is a game that you're hoping that you come back on the other end or fruit from other blocks that are newly planted, or some mechanism that you have supply and demand kind of mapped out. And if you don't have supply and demand mapped out, then the problem becomes a whack-a-mole where no outcome is good, if that makes sense. If you get to no outcome being good for the business, then you're basically, on a downward spiral.
As a community, I'm not saying any one of you are experiencing this, but is there a percent tolerance or threshold at which a contract gets dropped? I don't know.
Not yet, I would say. Yeah.
As in you've had no dropped contracts, or there's no agreed upon tolerance?
Both. Yet. And we've also, for fruit that we're picking in-house, kind of echoes similar to Ashton in that, like, there's zero tolerance, essentially. So logistically, like harvesting, like I said, we're already going out and flagging, like, as early as possible. So that cost is already kind of like built in. But like picking at night and trying to identify if you haven't flagged, that's a challenge, right? Now you're relying on the crew to look for red leaves. No, like, you have to mark those vines that you don't want to pick, right? And even with those marked, there's some challenges for the crews to see them in the middle of the night, right? So there's that. I think, like, picking differentially around the fruit depends on what fruit the wine is going into, right? If it's a bulk wine program or something, it's likely you're just picking straight through, right? So, I mean, I think you have to weigh the costs and benefit.
Do we have any questions from the audience? I can keep asking questions, but I want to make sure that we address the room.
Just want to thank the three of you for all the insights. This is really great. And Sarah, lovely job moderating. I wanted to ask quickly about Sauvignon Blanc. We're in a point in time in which a lot of vineyards in high density areas are analyzing removing vineyards and changing varieties. If the contracts aren't there, pricing isn't there, there's all these conversations going. And I'm just quite terrified that Sauvignon Blanc is going to continue this vicious cycle of, we'll pull it out and we'll plant it to Sauv Blanc because none of our neighbors are replanting. And then you have this repository of disease there. I just wonder if any of you would be able to comment on that, or if you've taken that into account in any of your conversations.
Yeah.
Rutherford?
Yeah. So we farm quite a bit of Sauv Blanc in Rutherford, and over the years we've learned that it has been it's been a problem for sure. We've had blocks that we couldn't find a negative vine, or a healthy vine. Like, we've been testing a lot. So I think it's always gonna be a problem in terms of monitoring. And you just kind of have to do your due diligence in terms of making sure you're getting clean planting material and testing those vines, as often as possible, and trying to also be precise in testing. In that, like, what we've seen, we typically see red blotch moving from the outside in, and so we would do we're random sampling, like a 40 or 50 foot buffer around the block, and seeing what comes back positive. And if we get a positive, then we're going back and testing those nearest neighbors to try and keep ahead of it.
I also have a block of Sauvignon Blanc that I'm terrified of. But we're going to put sections of 5 vines and do like 200 and test those annually or biannually, just to make sure we're aware if it's moving in.
Be aware.
Yeah, and I have yet to see any symptoms in Sauv Blanc, unfortunately. So
haven't heard of any.
that just makes it even harder.
think we have a question.
We got two, but then we have also one on Zoom that I'm going to sneak in. Do we know whether or not the cut made by harvesting a cluster does or doesn't spread the virus?
Fuchs?
No.
No.
Nope.
No.
Nope.
Okay.
No.
No.
I just
Where's
wanted
Monica?
them
There you
to
are.
say
Monica
it.
says emphatically no.
Monica says no.
Thank God. And Mark.
So if, in fact, this hopper is the vector, turns out to be the vector, most vineyards have some place where these things want to overwinter. What are the prospects for being able to modify the vineyard margins or something like this to remove some of the shielding that they might have for overwintering?
I think that is very challenging. The research has shown that Tika feed on a wide variety of hosts, and that are a lot of which are common weeds in our valley. So it's particularly challenging to eradicate all things that they can feed on. Overwintering, we're less familiar with and still doing research on, and Monica can pitch in on that. But there are repositories outside of the vineyard that are concerned, but they're just so widespread that it's challenging to focus on those as a mitigation strategy for the population of Tika itself. Monica later today is going to talk about how clear tilling is not necessary because they are feeding outside of the vineyard. Clear cultivating.
I can echo that. I mean, we've been doing that since that paper came out, and having monitored all of our acreage, and some of it is 100% cover crop, and then a lot of it, because of that paper suggesting that it will help reduce the Tika population. So, 80% of our acreage or something like that was clean cultivated, and we still saw quite a bit of girdles.
With our vine by vine mapping, I will say the patterns we see are very frequently along vineyard roads or along ditches where weeds can persist, and particularly, Spanish burr clover, and we have a list of species on our website as well.
Yeah.
So my question, excuse me, is about you've decided to pull the block, and now you're looking for replants. What is your protocol? What is your methodology? What is your way of going about finding a clean source for vines, knowing that there's a long latency and knowing that infections are still coming in with new planting material?
So the beauty of lamp testing in-house is we can test, we test, I think, 10 to 15% of any rootstocks that we receive and all of the budwood. I also normally request 100% mother vine testing. From there, I don't know.
Yeah, we use third-party testing, and that's kind of the best that we can do, I think.
Same.
I think this again speaks back to needing to address the questions being asked, and we need the nurseries to do better.
I have a question about the percentage of stem girdles. I guess this is mostly for Jake. About are they all coming from Tika? Are you seeing other stem girdlers?
Monica.
Monica's laughing.
A lot. I mean, it's hard to say, right? Unless you're actually seeing it on the petiole girdling, which I've definitely seen both Tika and Torticellis doing. But it could be another tree hopper. That's a Monica question.
Hi, I had a question for Ashton. You mentioned you pulled out a block, small block. Did you consider fumigating before you planted new vines and, with your standard Telon 2 or chloropictrin? maybe there's something that's left in the soil strata in between.
And that could be, we didn't. We follow an organic fungicide and insecticide model, so that's not really something the family would want to do. So, but that is an interesting idea, absolutely.
Hold, please. Got another one.
I suppose you've foregone the use of any legumes as cover crops in the vineyard?
Correct.
Yes.
Yes.
4 years ago.
Making my way back down. Oh, okay.
So going back to the question about nursery material coming in dirty with red blotch, I have never gotten the feeling that I've gotten a considerable amount, if any. But I haven't lamp tested every single vine that's come in. So from your experiences, have you ever caught anything like that?
I have not seen anything test positive that I have received budwood-wise or rootstock-wise, no. But this is we've only been doing this now for 2 years, and I receive maybe 5,000 vines a year. It's very small, so.
Yeah. So I map, select blocks, and I try to argue that it is a gradient coming in from outside, and that's the first question people always ask me is, how do you know it didn't come in through the nursery? So that's just frustrating for me, so that's why I wanted to ask.
Mapping.
Yeah.
How about hedgerows? Do you guys have any input on different types of plant species that people could plant hedgerows for a bio barrier?
Oh, I love this question, and I do think that there's a lot of value in having a hedgerow potentially between you and your neighbor if it comes to that. I have no idea, though. And Monica, that would be cool to look into.
Yeah.
Okay.
We hear from the audience that Mark will address this conversation a little bit later. Feeding hosts and gut content analysis.
Yeah, I don't know, because they can travel quite a bit of ways, so I don't know if a hedgerow is going to stop them, if that's the thinking.
I think I'd be curious, speaking of research questions, the height of the hedgerow, that if there's a bigger, not that this is non-invasive, but say a eucalyptus windbreak versus a low coyote brush hedgerows, there's a difference between that, certainly in terms of their moving capacity. But they do move far, and they do move randomly, and they're very frustrating.
We've got a question on Zoom. Regarding the pattern of spread of red blotch versus LR3, did you see much more aggregation among LR3 infections or dispersion?
I think the pattern's a little bit different. So LR3 tends to be more linear versus splatter. But initially, we actually had vines that tested positive for both as well. So that complicates things, because then you have corner cases that makes you really revisit the clusters. I think one of the things that capturing this data helps with virus maps over years and sharing them even across other vineyards is that we're using AI quite a bit in Scout to look for patterns. And so far, the patterns have been around plant and leaf. One thing that's very interesting is looking at spread patterns and virus patterns on a map and trying to look for things that maybe aren't obvious to us. Again, because we know the vectors are not doing the same thing all the time, it's trying to put some logic around something that maybe doesn't have logic. But we feel that it's very possible to create a model that starts giving you risk scores, at least in prioritizing where to sample and how to prioritize, how to, again, take your budget of this is how many tests I humanly can do, asymptomatic versus symptomatic, and taking that budget and saying, how would I assign it, and am I getting benefit out of that or not?
Yes, and I think that's a good point about different pests and the different vectors in which these two diseases are spread. Vine mealybug is a crawler. Ashton's much more likely to get it. Leaf roll from me, whereas the three-cornered alfalfa hopper can hop up to a mile. So Jake is just as equally as likely. I don't say just, but there are different spreading patterns with these different viruses, specifically because of the different vectors that spread them.
I want to sneak in two more quick questions. One is, are any of you treating for Tika? Just wanted to hear some general thoughts about that. It's something that we haven't discussed quite yet. And the other one is, these are some pretty robust management protocols you have in place, and I'm sure they differ from block to block, but on average, I'd be curious to hear what you are spending per acre for an average acre where you have your normal protocol in place to monitor and manage for red blotch. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear that, and also kind of in the context of people looking to tighten their belts on farming costs. Are you able to justify continuing those moving forward in some of those more price-sensitive blocks?
To answer your first question about treating, we are testing some materials out. One of them being Savanto. And what essentially we did, long story short, was caught Tika and caged them. We sprayed a block, and then each consecutive day we would catch 10 Tika, cage them on chutes, come back the following day to see if they were alive or dead. And we kept doing that until we found that it seemed to the material started not working, right? With most materials that we tested, Savanto, Asail, Belay, Venom, all of them seem to have some level of efficacy up to 4 to 5 days post-application. So we are trying to utilize that tool as an option, and timing, that's also why we're monitoring for girdles, so we can kind of see when they're there, right? Like, and then doing that, consecutively over a couple months. Budget-wise, with those treatments, it's just the material cost. So we're already going out with our fungicide spray, so there's not much additional cost to that. The other monitoring and mapping and scouting, I'd say for us, it's probably an additional maybe $400 to $500 an acre, something like that. I mean, and it depends, right, on especially the mapping. Like if there's a block that has a lot of red vines, there's a lot more to map. So.
Kia, Ashton, do you have any other thoughts about budgeting per acre for active management?
Yeah, I think on the mapping side, we've tried to automate as much of this within the product so that it's cost effective. So it could be about, again, similar pricing, except we think the map could be used for multiple things, so that you use it not just for virus, as I said, but even yield estimates, peak zones, even replants too, so that you have kind of this running model. The testing cost is the big variable, and we have a different budget per block based on prior infection rates. And so the amount of testing we have to do, and also, if I'm being, transparent, neighbor exposure, areas that we don't control. So we are significantly kind of overloaded in one section, the blocks in the vineyard. And we do have to, from a budget standpoint, keep rotating that on where the hot spots are. So almost like a firefighter, kind of same budget, and heaven forbid, if we're doing a good job, we're containing it. If we're doing a bad job, then, and in these difficult times, I think the question all of us have to ask is hitting the reset button. So I think my neighbor, when he came and saw what I was doing with Scout, he said, I wish I did that rather than doing a replant, because there's no fruit and you have to wait, and there's no guarantee then when you do the replant that you're not going to be in the same situation. And I'm not saying that, I'm not advocating you shouldn't pull everything out in certain cases, but there's a degree of tolerance where, like a wildfire, it becomes out of control. And my view is that if you can keep it contained and understood to the degree we understand it, it financially pays for itself rather than doing a big cost and hoping that in the future somehow this doesn't happen again.
Ashton, it sounds like as an estate, financially it makes sense, or you wouldn't be doing it.
Exactly. When we put together our budgets, we have like a target number of vines that we want to test. So this previous year was we budgeted for around 10,000 vines.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we came in at around 7. As far as if we were going to look at the entire estate, all in, time, effort, money, it would probably be around $500 an acre.
And because of the quality of the wine, you're able to be high touch, high attention to detail. If you were to give any advice to somebody just facing the problem, minimum budget, minimum resources, what are some of the key things you would advise or do at a bare minimum status, like better than nothing versus the cost of doing nothing?
Map, and I would say rogue. Like, try to get your virus level in your vineyard as low as possible.
And by that, you mean carving, like not just vine by vine?
Not just vine by vine, yeah.
I think it's also a map visually really tells more of a story than an Excel sheet with a bunch of numbers on it, right? So when we need to go to ownership, and show maps year over year over year how and where it's spreading, I think that speaks a lot stronger than going, okay, we have another 10% infection this year and 10%, I think
and
it just
hotspots visually drive the problem. Yeah.
And if it's possible, I'd love to actually show a couple of examples visually. I don't know
Do
if
we
that's
have-
possible. That's okay, no worries.
For our friends on Zoom, we have an anonymous question. Going back to the cultivation topic, the panel discussed Tika feeding, but isn't the goal of early cultivation to remove breeding hosts? Wasn't this the focus of Cindy Cron's earlier work?
I don't know if it was necessarily to remove breeding hosts. I think the idea was that you almost treated your cover crops as like a trap crop, right? The degree day model was meant to tell you when like the first generation nymphs would roughly be in the cover crop, and in theory then if you're removing that, you're removing food source and other plant hosts of Tika.
We're getting a nod from Mark.
All right,
Thank
cool.
you. Well answered, Jake.
Yes.
One more quickie from Zoom. Do you test and or remove Vitis californica from forests adjacent to your vineyard?
That's a great question.
I have tested wild grapevine that's near one of our reservoirs. On the valley floor, I would say you do that, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, we haven't personally, but we do, on part of the Rutherford restoration or river restoration project, that's something that we have been doing. And I know, I think from Fuchs's studies that they have found wild vitis in that positive in that area.
It's the only
so
other plant that can carry it as a
I would
host,
highly
yes.
recommend removing it.
Where possible, remove the native grapevines as a
The
potential
RCD,
host.
no go in there, I think.
All right. Well, thank you all for your candor and your comments and sharing all your insights. This has been a fantastic panel, and we're all walking away with way more information than we came in with. So thank you so much for sharing all your experiences.
Thank you.